Okay, everyone. Welcome to this special once-in-a-lifetime conference on the ethics of omissions and the law of omissions. Let me start with a confession. Yesterday, I realized that we had forgotten to put together a list of the people who have helped make this conference a reality. That led to the thought of whether we were morally responsible for having forgotten, which led to further cogitation that distracted me from the act of putting the list together. Okay, I promise that's the last omissions joke you will hear from me today. I don't know about tomorrow. We would like to start by thanking the most generous of benefactors, Peter Lewis, who unfortunately isn't here right now, although he is supposed to be coming shortly. Peter is a close family friend, someone with a deep appreciation of all the humanities, and of philosophy in particular, a wisdom lover in the true sense of the word philosopher. It is thanks in no small part to his encouragement at a critical time in my life that I chose the path I did. My parents wanted me to become President of the United States. I think I chose wisely. Not that I could have become president, because I was born abroad, but never mind. Luckily, Peter is here with us, well, not right now, but he will be with us today, graciously accompanied by his daughter, Maud. Please join me in thanking Peter and Maud for their generous support of the conference. And here they are, actually. Hi. So I'm just going to replay this. Is that all right? We would like to start by thanking the most generous of benefactors, Peter Lewis. Peter is a close family friend, someone with a deep appreciation of all the humanities and of philosophy in particular, a wisdom lover in the true sense of the word philosopher. It's thanks in no small part to his encouragement at a critical time in my life that I chose the path I did. My parents wanted me to become president, right, Peter? I think I chose wisely. Luckily, Peter is with us today, graciously accompanied by his daughter, Maud. Please join us in welcoming him with a round of applause. We would also like to thank two people without whose assistance we would not have been able to invite all the luminaries in this room. The former UCSD Dean of Arts and Humanities, Seth Lehrer, and the present Dean, Christina Della Coletta, who've given this conference enthusiastic support from the very beginning. We are grateful to them and to their staff for their financial and logistical assistance. And a big thank you goes out to the sculptor, Bruno Catalano, who allowed us to use an image of one of his wonderful Voyager sculptures for our conference poster, and to our daughter Sophie for helping put, that is to say, for putting the poster together. We would also like to thank the selfless faculty, staff, and graduate students in the UCSD department for donating their time and a great deal of their effort. We are thinking in particular of Suzanne Dager, Susan Winchester, Andy Liedholm, who is videotaping the conference right now. Thank you, Andy. Our department chair, Craig Callender, and all the UCSD commentators and chairs on the conference program. Thanks to you all. Now, just a few words about the mechanics of the question and answer session following the presentations by speaker and commentator. We have 3 microphones. There's a clip-on mic, sometimes used by the speaker or sometimes used by the commentator by agreement. There's obviously a podium mic. Please speak, well, not too closely into the podium mic, but please speak into the podium mic when you are presenting. And there'll be a handheld wireless microphone that will be roving around during the Q&A. Speakers and commentators should feel free to use whichever mic they wish during their presentations. But for the discussion, we will reserve the podium mic for, well, whichever speaker or commentator prefers to use the podium mic, and the handheld mic for the audience. Session chairs will decide whom to call on. In your conference folder, or I think Eric Watkins might have been giving you your number, you will find a page with a number, a large number on it, or a small number on it. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your number and engage the chair's attention. The chair will write down your number. Dick, are you paying attention? Yeah. The chair will write down your number and will call on you by number. If you are called on, please wait for the mic to reach you, and then please identify yourself before asking your question. Because we are roughly 35 strong and we want to give as many conference participants the chance to ask questions, please ask only one question and not a multi-part, six-part question if you could, and reserve a second question for later after everyone else has had a chance to ask their questions. You will likely have more opportunities to talk to the speakers and commentators during the breaks and during lunch. And now, without further ado,
Our first session, the speaker is George Sher. I want to say that he holds the Gene Autry, I know that's not right, the Gene Autry Chair at Rice, but he holds an endowed chair at Rice where he's been a faculty member for many years at the University of Vermont. Before that, he's the author of a string of books on a variety of topics, moving around, desert and blame and others. And most recently, he's muscled in on the territory of political philosophers with a wonderful book, Equality for Inegalitarians. That's George Sher. The commentator later will be Professor Heidi Hurd of the University of Illinois Law School. She's the David Baum Professor there. She was Dean of the Law School before that. She's had a distinguished career with many, has two books forthcoming. One of her books is called has the engaging title, Moral Combat. She's written on a wide array of topics in legal philosophy and political philosophy. Her career has spanned several law schools. She spent a lot of time at the University of Pennsylvania. We were actually fortunate to have her in San Diego for a time at the University of San Diego Law School. So that will be Heidi Hurd who will be commentating. So first, George Sher, and the topic is unintentional omissions. Thank
you. Does this mic, I guess it does work, doesn't it? Thanks. Does it still work? Yes. So people who are brave talk their papers, and people who are less self-confident read their papers. And I'm one of the less self-confident ones, so I'm going to read my paper. When I was a graduate student at Columbia, I commuted to New Jersey to teach classes at a nearby university. One Wednesday in January, at about noon, I received a call at home from my department head asking if I was all right. The occasion for the call was a barrage of inquiries from my students asking where their instructor was. I had known that the new semester was going to begin soon, but as it turned out, I was off by a week. I never paid a price for my regrettable lapse. My department chair, a sweet, kind man, accepted my explanation and apology at face value. This better? Okay, good. I never paid a price for my regrettable lapse. My department chair, a sweet, kind man, accepted my explanation and apology at face value and contented himself with urging me to pay more attention to the calendar in the future. But I deserved worse, and he would have been well within his rights to fire me on the spot. It was an unintentional omission, but I was surely responsible and surely blameworthy for it. In what follows, I will try to extract some belated benefit from this unfortunate incident by probing the judgments it elicits. Many agree that we are sometimes blameworthy for our unintended omissions, but there is less agreement about how this can be so. Taking my own lapse as a starting point, I will present a somewhat truncated version of the dialectic that yields what I view as the correct explanation. In so doing, I will cover some familiar ground, but also, I hope, expose some relatively unexplored patches of terrain. What exactly is the problem about blaming an agent for his unintended omission? There is, I think, not one problem, but several. And to bring these fully into view, I'll begin by distinguishing three possible ways in which someone might fail to meet his classes without intending to do so. In the first scenario, the agent doesn't intend to miss the classes, but he does intend to do does intend something else, could be finishing up a paper, visiting an ailing parent in another state, extending a delightful romantic weekend, and lots of other things. He does intend something else that he knows will cause him to miss them. In this scenario, the omission is not itself intended, but rather is a foreseen consequence of an action that is performed intentionally. When philosophers discuss the intended-foreseen distinction, the question they generally have in mind is whether intentionally causing a bad outcome is ever or always worse than merely allowing it to occur. And this question leads swiftly to various deep and difficult problems. However, for present purposes, what needs to be stressed is simply that these problems have little bearing on our understanding of either responsibility or blame. For whatever we say about the comparative wrongness of intentionally, as opposed to knowingly, producing a bad outcome, the mere realization that an act will have a bad outcome is enough to guarantee that outcome's inclusion in the factors in light of which the agent decides to perform the action. This point holds independently of the nature of the expected outcome. Independently, that is, of whether it is an event, the non-occurrence of an event, an action, an abstention from acting, or the simple non-performance of an act. Thus, when an agent intentionally performs an action whose foreseen but unintended consequences include his not performing some further act, his acceptance of the latter omission is a straightforward expression of his will. And for this reason, his not intending the omission does not prevent us from connecting it to his will in a way that supports the conclusion that he is responsible for it. Consider next a scenario in which the agent does not know that he is missing his classes. Instead, he thinks they won't begin until the following week, and while he is not quite sure, he is confident enough to think it unnecessary to check. Because the agent in this scenario at least has doubts which he declines to pursue, it may still seem possible to explain why he is responsible for his omission by representing the omission as an expression of his will. Although what links him to his failure to meet his classes cannot be a choice to do something that he knows will cause him to miss them, we may still locate the linkage in a choice not to do something which he thinks might prevent his missing them. Hence, on this account, the explanation of why he is responsible for his unintended omission may simply be that he has decided to risk it. This explanation works reasonably well for some variants of the second scenario. It remains plausible in particular when the probability that the agent assigns to his being in error about the date is higher than the probability of error that he correctly takes to trigger the obligation to check. As long as this condition is met, his decision not to check is a decision not to do something that he correctly believes he is under an obligation to do. And for this reason, we can reasonably invoke this decision to explain why he can be blamed, both for not fulfilling his obligation to check and, by extension, for not fulfilling the further obligation that checking would have revealed. But this explanation begins to falter when we substitute the assumption that the agent's twinge of uncertainty does not lead him to believe that the likelihood of his being wrong surpasses the crucial threshold. In this variant of the case, his decision not to check is not a decision to refrain from doing something he thinks he should do. As long as the agent does not believe that not checking is wrong, its wrongness is no part of anything he willingly accepts. Thus, by extension, the wrongness of his ensuing failure to meet his classes is no part of anything he has willingly accepted either. Moreover, the viability of the proposed explanation diminishes further when we add the supposition that he is right in believing that he is not obligated to check. He may, for example, be right in believing this because he knows both that his memory has very rarely failed him and that his doubts are only the latest manifestation of a far larger pattern of obsession that has regularly caused him all manner of grief. In a case of this sort, the agent's decision not to check the date may actually be a triumph rather than a lapse. Moreover, triumph or not, his choosing not to check can hardly render him blameworthy or responsible for missing his classes. if he correctly believes he has no good reason to check. Thus, if we are to explain why he is blameworthy for missing his classes, we must somehow connect him to his omission without bringing that omission under the umbrella of his will. And, a fortiori, we must also do this if the possibility that classes have already begun is not on his radar at all. This is the third of our possible scenarios, and as it happens, it was the actual one. In the event, the mistaken conviction that classes wouldn't start until next week was simply among my unquestioned background beliefs. I'm not sure how I got that idea. I may have formed it because classes had begun later in the previous year, because the later start date was somehow salient to me, or for some other reason. But at the time when classes actually began, the belief that they wouldn't start until later was just another unremarkable element in my overall picture of the world. This scenario, in which the false expectation is just another background belief, is the most problematic of the three. For the main reason the agent in our previous scenario had forechecking, namely his twinge of doubt, is no longer present. When there is no red flag, our default position must be to trust our background beliefs. We have neither the time nor the resources to check any but the tiniest subset of them, and any systematic attempt to do so would, in any case, only generate a new set that was just as much in need of checking as the original. Thus, even if our third scenario agent had deliberately chosen not to check, his lack of any reason to check would deprive us of grounds for blaming him for choosing to risk failing to meet his classes. Also, of course, our third scenario is one in which it never occurs to the agent to check, and is therefore one in which he does not choose not to check. For both reasons, we cannot explain why the third scenario agent is responsible or blameworthy by construing his failure to meet his classes as a straightforward expression of his will. But that third scenario agent is just the earlier me, and it seems clear that I was both responsible and blameworthy for not meeting my classes. Thus, some different explanation of his or my culpability is evidently called for. In the current section, I'll briefly examine the two most familiar ways of providing one. One ever-popular alternative is to trace my failure to realize that I should check the calendar to some previous choice that I made in the awareness that it would leave me vulnerable to some such omission. My having made such a choice would establish a clear, if indirect, connection between my omission and my will. However, in the case at hand, the point at which I might have made that earlier choice, and just what might have prompted me to make it, and what its content might have been, are not at all easy to see. Because my memory had served me well enough on previous occasions, I simply took its continued reliability for granted, and so never even entertained, much less considered and rejected, the possibility of taking precautions against error. It can, of course, be claimed that I must have known that memory sometimes fails, and that this knowledge, together with the importance of getting it right, was sufficient to place me under an obligation to take some such precautions. For reasons again related to limitations of time and resources, I think this claim is implausible. However, even if correct, it would not alter the fact that there was no earlier point at which I actually did choose to ignore or flout whatever obligation I was under. And for this reason, there is simply no earlier exercise of will whose culpability might connect me to my subsequent unintended omission. Such problems have been noticed by many, and in my opinion, they decisively defeat the use of the tracing strategy in the current context. Thus, if the only way to justify the claim that I was blameworthy or responsible were to link my omission to my will, then we would have to conclude that I was neither. But while some philosophers would be happy to accept this conclusion, others, myself included, would instead regard it as a reductio of the view that agents are only responsible and can only be blamed for outcomes that are either direct or indirect expressions of their will. For us, the challenge is to explain what other relation between an agent and an outcome might establish that he is responsible or blameworthy for it. Of those who have sought to meet this challenge, The majority have done so by relocating the crucial link from the agent's will to his values, attitudes, or judgments. Although the details vary, the general idea is that we are responsible for our acts and their outcomes just when and just because they reflect or give expression to our judgments about what matters. Judgments that need not be either consciously arrived at or within our voluntary control, but which nevertheless strongly influence what we notice, what occurs to us, and the attitudes that inform the intentions with which we act. If all voluntary choices are grounded in judgments about the value of what is chosen, as many believe, then this account will subsume the volitional view. But it will also go beyond that view by supporting attributions of responsibility and blame for many acts and occurrences that do not originate in the agent's will. In particular, when a person unintentionally fails to do something he should, the current account will allow us to hold him responsible, as long as his failure to realize what he should do is explained by its lack of importance to him. Does this account explain why I was both responsible and blameworthy for failing to meet my classes? Did my omission betray an unconscionably cavalier attitude toward my teaching commitments? Would my department head have been correct if he had said, "If you cared enough, you would have remembered"? There is one interpretation under which that assertion clearly would have been true. There must be some amount of caring that would have been enough to cause me to remember. I might, for example, have cared so much that I camped out in front of the classroom building so as not to miss the influx of students. Or I might have carried the academic calendar around and checked it every 5 minutes. Thus, to make my chair's imagined assertion come out true, we could say that what determines whether someone cares enough is simply whether he actually remembers. However, if the assertion that I did not care enough is made true simply by the fact that I forgot, then that assertion will convey no independent information about why my level of care, as opposed to the omission to which it gave rise, was defective. In that case, it will contribute nothing to our understanding of why I was blameworthy for the omission. To help explain that, the assertion must be backed by some independent norm of sufficiency. To care enough in the relevant sense, one must care as much as one should in light of the importance of what is at stake. However, as so interpreted, the claim that I would have remembered if I had cared enough is not obviously true. For whether a person remembers something depends not only on how much he cares about whatever depends on his remembering, but also on whether that amount of caring is enough to carry the day against whatever distractions or preoccupations might distort or eclipse his memory. A level of caring that would be sufficient to prevent someone from forgetting, as long as there is little pressure on his memory, may not be sufficient when there is greater pressure. And for this reason, even someone who cares as much as he should about remembering when his classes meet may end up forgetting if some memory distorting factor exerts a powerful enough influence. So did I care enough? Is my failure to remember best explained by my lack of concern about meeting my classes? Or is it better explained by some factor that caused me to forget, despite the adequacy of my level of concern? The answer, I think, is unclear. A point in favor of my having cared enough is that I'm generally very conscientious, though admittedly more now than then. A point against it is that I was not then subject to any unusual emotional turbulence. A countervailing point in its favor is that the mere passage of time after a belief is formed can be a powerful distorting factor, and, as I have subsequently discovered, often is so in my case. Whatever the relevant norm of caring comes to, I think the empirical question of whether I satisfied it could go either way. But that's not enough to save the proposed explanation. For what needs to be explained does not depend on the same empirical facts. The case for my being responsible for failing to meet my classes, and for my deserving to be blamed for it, rests strictly on the surface facts that I missed the classes, and that I had none of the standard excuses for doing so. If that case is convincing, as I think it is, then my blameworthiness will require explanation both on the supposition that I did care as much as I should have, and on the supposition that I did not. Because I would remain blameworthy even if I did turn out to care enough, the explanation of why I was blameworthy can hardly be that I did not care enough. Moreover, from the need for an explanation that applies under either assumption, we can infer that even if I did not care enough, my lack of concern can hardly be the whole story. But what other explanatory possibilities are there? Where, if neither in my will nor in the evaluation, if neither in my will, where, if neither in my will, nor in the evaluative judgments that grounded my level of concern, can we find a connection between me and my failure to meet my classes that might explain why I was responsible for not meeting them? In the previous section, I suggested that because a person's voluntary decisions are themselves standardly rooted in his evaluative judgments, the view that takes agents to be linked to their actions by their evaluative judgments may be capable of subsuming the one that takes them to be linked to their actions by their wills. Just so, I now want to add that there is a further view which seems capable of subsuming both of these, namely, the view that the crucial linkage between an agent and his actions, or abstentions and omissions and so on, that crucial linkage consists precisely of the fact that those actions, etc., are rooted in the very constellation of desires, attitude, dispositions, and subpersonal states that together make him the person he is. Put most simply, the reason this view seems capable of subsuming the others is that an agent's evaluative judgments and his choices both stand between his underlying attitudes, dispositions, and states and his acts and omissions. Because this is so, because it is just the interaction of an agent's attitudes, dispositions, and states that gives rise both to whichever evaluative judgments inform his actions, and, at least if determinism is true, to whichever choices or volitions issue in them, the current proposal assigns a significant explanatory role to those choices and judgments without asking them to bear more weight than they can comfortably accommodate. At the same time, because the interaction of a person's attitudes, dispositions, and states can also influence his behavior in ways that bypass his evaluative judgments and choices, the proposal also allows agents to stand in blame-sustaining relations to acts and omissions, which are neither chosen by them nor reflective of their judgments about what matters. Elsewhere, I've argued at length that it is precisely the fact that our acts and omissions are rooted in our constitutive states and traits that explains why it often makes sense to blame and hold us responsible for them. And in what follows, I will present just enough of the argument to allow me to sketch an explanation of why I was blameworthy for failing to meet my classes. Then, with that explanation in hand, I'll end by briefly addressing a difficulty which many compatibilist views face, but only mine seems capable of answering. That sounds a bit immodest. But which mine is among those which are capable. Now the syntax is messed up. You know what I mean. I can answer it even if others can too. Okay. For present purposes, the two aspects of my view that need elaboration are first, the nature of the crucial relation between an agent's constitutive features and his acts and omissions, and second, the criterion for classifying a feature of an agent as constitutive. Where the crucial relation is concerned, what requires emphasis is that I do not take it to involve any expressive or representational element. When I describe the interaction of an agent's constitutive features as giving rise to an act or omission of a particular sort, I do not mean to suggest that that act or omission must express or manifest any corresponding disposition or trait, as, for example, a cruel act might express or manifest the broader vice of cruelty. And neither do I mean that it, the act or omission, must correspond in any other way to the representational content of any operative state, trait, or judgment. Instead, as I understand it, The responsibility-sustaining relation between an agent's constitutive states and his acts and omissions is starkly and straightforwardly causal. This means that even if each member of a given collection of constitutive states is either morally good or morally neutral, their interaction may still issue in, and so may still stand in the crucial relation to, an act or omission that itself is morally bad. But what next determines which of an agent's states, traits, and dispositions are constitutive in the relevant sense? What in particular distinguishes such causes of action or omission as psychosis, massive brain hemorrhage, and total paralysis, each of which seems external to an agent and would presumably excuse him from responsibility and blame, from whichever causes would not excuse him? We cannot without circularity take this to depend on whether the agent is responsible or blameworthy for the act to which the feature in question causally contributes, since that is just what the act being caused by his constitutive features is supposed to establish. But what in that case does determine whether a given feature of an agent is constitutive? My answer in brief is that this depends on whether that feature is part of the larger constellation of states and traits, whose members interact in ways that causally support the agent's broader rational capacities. We assess and respond to reasons whenever we deliberate, plan, and make decisions. And if we were not generally able to do this effectively, then questions about whether we are responsible or blameworthy for particular acts or omissions would not arise at all. This does not show that responsible agents are nothing but centers of rational and volitional abilities. These conceptions seem too thin to be plausible. But it does suggest that the psychological and physical features that constitute us as responsible selves are just the ones whose organization sustains our rational and volitional abilities. It is, I think, precisely the manifest inability of features such as psychosis and paralysis to play this role that explains why they seem so clearly external. At first glance, this way of specifying an agent's constitutive features may seem ill-suited to my larger aim. For in order to invoke this specification as part of an explanation of what connects an agent to his moral lapse, I would have to say that the very same psychophysical features whose interaction is causally responsible for the agent's general success at recognizing and responding to reasons are on this occasion causally responsible for his failure to respond appropriately to them. However, while I do in fact want to say both things, I don't think there is any real conflict between them. We are all familiar with systems whose functional organization reliably issues in particular sorts of outcomes, but on rare occasions fails to do so. This is true of spark plugs, computers, subway systems, power grids, and there is no reason why it should not be true of rational agents as well. My proposal, then, is that the reason I was responsible for failing to meet my classes on schedule is that that failure had its origins in some glitch or fault in the very same psychophysical system whose functional organization generally did allow me to recognize and live up to my obligations. In advancing this proposal, I take no position on where in the system things went wrong, or even whether the problem is most plausibly located at the psychological or the neurochemical level. My point is simply that wherever the breakdown occurred, and whatever it involved, the rational behavior supporting system in which it occurred remains a plausible candidate, I think a uniquely plausible one, for identification with the me to whom the ensuing lapse is rightly attributed. By thinking of the self in this way, we can accommodate the idea that there is much more to us than what appears on the conscious surface, without entirely losing contact with the consciousness and rationality that underpin our moral standing. In so doing, we can locate the responsible self at just the right distance from the rationality that has long been thought to define him. In my case, the interaction of the system's elements both sustained my general ability to remember things and respond to the reasons they provide, and prevented me from remembering the fact that provided my reason on the relevant occasion. Because the system's failure was, in this respect, my failure it is not surprising that I deserve blame for it. In mounting this argument, I am asserting both that agents are always exempt from responsibility and blame, when they entirely lack the capacity to recognize or respond to reasons, and that they are not always exempted or excused when they are incapable only of recognizing or responding to their reasons for performing certain specific acts. But is this really a consistent combination of views? If a person's broad inability to respond to reasons is enough to get him off the hook, then why shouldn't this far narrower inability be sufficient as well? And in particular, if it would have been inappropriate to blame or hold me responsible for failing to meet my classes, if I were altogether incapable of recognizing or responding to reasons, then how can it be appropriate to blame or hold me responsible when I had the general capacity, but was incapable of recognizing the reasons that obtained at the crucial time? The first thing to say about this question is that it does not apply only to my own account. Versions of it also arise for views such as those of J. Wallace and Tim Scanlon, who also maintain both that we cannot legitimately blame or hold agents responsible when they lack certain broadly reasons-related capacities, and that we can sometimes blame and hold them responsible for acts or omissions which are due to temporary or local gaps in these capacities. However, although the problem arises across a significant segment of the compatibilist spectrum, not all compatibilists are equally well positioned to resolve it. To bring this out, we may first observe that while there is wide agreement that a general capacity to recognize and respond to reasons is a necessary condition for responsibility and blameworthiness, there is no similar agreement about why that general capacity is necessary. Within the post-Strawsonian literature, we can distinguish at least two broadly and partially overlapping ways of accounting for the requirement. Of these broad patterns of explanation, one emphasizes the unpleasantness of being held responsible, while the other focuses on its dialogic nature. On the unpleasantness account, the justification for taking responsibility and blameworthiness to require reasons responsiveness is that, and this is a quote, by holding accountable only agents who have the general powers of reflective self-control, we ensure that those who are exposed to the harms of blame and moral sanction have a reasonable opportunity to avoid them insofar as they are competent to control their behavior by the light of moral reasons. That's J. Wallace. On this account, the unpleasantness of blame is said to make it a minor form of punishment, and the rationale for requiring that blamees possess the reasons-related capacities is to prevent them from being punished unfairly. By contrast, on the dialogic account, the emphasis shifts from blame's impact on the blamee to its significance for the one doing the blaming. On this account, expressing blame is a way of communicating one's displeasure with, or of raising questions about, the agent's apparent decision not to respond to his reasons for not doing what he did. And here the point of requiring that the agent have the broader reasons-related capacities is, roughly, to secure a necessary condition for uptake. If an agent lacks these capacities, then the relevant form of communication will simply not be possible. As Gary Watson puts the point, this is another quote, insofar as the negative reactive attitudes express demands, or in some cases appeals, addressed to another moral self, they are conceptually conditioned in various ways. One condition is that to be fully a moral self, the other must possess sufficient, for what? Moral understanding. These attitudes are incipiently forms of moral address. It's a famous quotation from Watson. Can either way of explaining why blameworthiness requires reasons responsiveness support a principal distinction between those agents who altogether lack the reason-related capacities and those others who are incapable only of responding to a narrower range of reasons? Where the fairness-based justification is concerned, the answer is pretty clearly no. For even when someone is broadly incapable of recognizing or responding to reasons, what is unfair about blaming him for acting wrongly in a particular case is precisely that his general incapacity has rendered him incapable of recognizing or responding to whatever reasons applied in just the case at hand. Because this is so, because there is a sense in which all reasons, like all politics, are local, it seems that anyone who believes that it is unfair to blame those who are not reasons responsive at all must also believe that it is unfair to blame a reasons responder like the earlier me for my failure to respond to the particular reason that I had to show up on the appointed day. At first glance, the prospects for arriving at a successful, satisfactory explanation may seem to improve when we turn to the expressive or communicative account. For whereas someone who is broadly incapable of recognizing or responding to reasons will also lack the capacity to understand what others are expressing or trying to communicate when they blame or hold him responsible, a person who is incapable only of recognizing or responding to the reasons for not acting as he does need not lack this further capacity. Even though my memory lapse meant that I could never recognize nor respond to my reason for showing up to class when it was time to do so, I was perfectly capable of understanding and responding appropriately, both to my department chair's questions about why I was absent and to his mild subsequent reproach. Hence, by stressing the importance of responses like these, a proponent of the communicative account may indeed seem able to explain why his rationale for exempting those who lack the general reason-related capacities does not extend to those whose incapacities are merely local. It seems to me, however, that no such explanation is forthcoming. For even if after-the-fact reproaches and requests for explanations are more likely to be understood by agents whose earlier incapacity to respond to reasons was merely local than by those whose earlier incapacity was global, the ability to understand them is at best a necessary condition for blameworthiness. On any reasonable construal, the dialogic account will also take blameworthiness to require some sort of moral defect in the act or omission that triggers whatever reproach or request for information is forthcoming. So, for example, in his recent exemplary development of this approach, Michael McKenna has written that even an agent who has the requisite understanding is only blameworthy if his act or omission displays a defective quality of will. There is, of course, room for debate about just what this further requirement comes to, but for present purposes, its exact content does not matter. Instead, the point is simply that it is pretty clearly the requirement that is not satisfied by the person who cannot respond to reasons at all. This point is significant because the natural explanation of why that person's will cannot be defective is precisely that his general inability to respond to reasons renders him incapable of responding to the particular reasons that tell against his current act or omission. However, if that is the correct explanation, then we will again be without an answer to the question of why I was more blameworthy for not responding to a reason that I didn't know I had than I would have been if I hadn't been able to respond to reasons at all. Because that question is problematic for many, if not all, compatibilists, it is no more damaging to my account than it is to many others. However, if the question cannot be answered, then anyone who takes responsibility to require the general rational capacities will be under pressure to preserve consistency by rejecting the judgment that I was responsible and blameworthy for failing to meet my classes. Because that judgment has and retains, I think, considerable intuitive appeal, it is worth noting that there is at least one account, not coincidentally my own, that does have the resources to answer the question. The key to my answer lies in the distinctive role that I assign to the general rational capacities. Like most other compatibilists, I view the possession of these capacities as necessary for both responsibility and blameworthiness. But unlike most others, I arrive at this conclusion via an indirect route. As noted above, I understand the relation that renders an agent responsible and blameworthy for a given act or omission in purely causal terms. I take that relation to consist exclusively of the fact that the act or omission is causally explained by the interaction of the agent's constitutive features. And I take a feature of an agent to be constitutive whenever it is part of the larger set of features whose interaction sustains his broader rational capacities. On this account, the reason the general rational capacities are necessary for responsibility and blame is, first, that in their absence a person will lack the organization that allows us to identify some of his features as constitutive, and second, that if none of his features are relevantly constitutive, then he will never stand in the relation to any act or omission that allows us to blame or hold him responsible for it. But if this is why the general rational capacities are required for responsibility and blame, then there is no comparable reason to say that no one can be responsible or blameworthy if he is incapable of recognizing or responding to whatever reasons obtain in his particular situation. Even if someone is entirely incapable of recognizing or responding to those particular reasons, his being reasons responsive in a broad enough range of alternative conditions will mean that there must be something about the way he is organized that sustains this general capacity. And that will be enough to guarantee that some subset of his features is constitutive in the specified sense. Because we will thus be able to make sense of the idea that some of his features are constitutive, we will also be able to make sense of the idea that his current failure to recognize or respond to a given reason is due to the anomalous interaction of some members of the constitutive set. And for this reason, my broader account will imply that there is nothing inconsistent about maintaining that I would not have been responsible or blameworthy for missing my classes if I had been generally incapable of recognizing or responding to reasons, but that given my possession of the general capacity, I was both responsible and blameworthy when the combination of features that supported it failed me on the crucial occasion.